In the damp, forgotten hills of 1830s England, a reclusive entomologist named Alistair Finch opened a private asylum for women of delicate nervous disposition. For 2 decades, his Fenwood apiary was hailed by the aristocracy as a miracle. Its signature product, a golden honey known as the Nectar of Lethe, was said to cure melancholy, soothe hysteria, and bring peace to the most tormented minds. But the women who were sent home were not cured. They were hollowed out, their eyes vacant, their deepest emotions gone. The truth, recorded in Finch's private journals and the chemical composition of his honey, was that his unique breed of bees did not bring peace. They were collectors. They harvested human sorrow, fear, and secrets directly from the source, distilling them into a golden liquor that allowed one to consume the very soul of another. Tonight, we unseal the hives of the Fenwood apiary. But you must understand, this channel is a descent. We do not tell stories to entertain. We uncover hidden mechanisms of power to awaken. If you are one of the few who is tired of the tranquil surface and seeks the machinery grinding away in the dark, then you belong here. Subscribe and prove you are ready to see. And tell me this in the comments below. What is a secret you would pay any price to know? The horror of Fenwood was not a haunting. It was a cold, biological process. It was the calculated industrialization of human empathy, the systematic bottling of emotion to be sold as a luxury commodity. It was an atrocity of the soul, disguised as pastoral care and the gentle work of nature. Our story is set on the windswept moors of the Peak District, a landscape of gray skies, perpetual mist, and deep, isolated valleys where superstition clung like the damp. It was the dawn of the age of steam and iron, but here time moved differently. In the most secluded of these valleys, a place the locals called the Sorrow Vale for the strange, melancholy quality of its silence, stood Fenwood Manor. It was a crumbling Jacobean estate, choked by ivy and surrounded by a high stone wall. But its most unnerving feature was the dozens of black-lacquered beehives that dotted the grounds, arranged not in neat rows, but in strange, spiraling patterns that seemed to mimic the shape of a human ear. The air around the manor hummed, a low, constant, hypnotic thrum that could be felt in your bones, a sound that kept all but the most desperate away. Alistair Finch arrived in Sorrow Vale on a damp autumn evening in 1831, a man who seemed to have been spun from the mist itself. He was unnervingly thin, with a stooped, almost chitinous frame that was always wrapped in a severe black coat, regardless of the weather. His face was dominated by large, dark eyes behind thick spectacles, which magnified his gaze and gave him the appearance of a nocturnal insect studying the world with unnerving intensity. His fingers were long, pale, and delicate, moving with a surgeon's precision, whether he was adjusting his spectacles or simply turning a page in a book. He spoke with the quiet, clipped accent of the academic elite, a voice that was calm and reasonable, yet carried no warmth whatsoever. He had an unnerving habit of holding perfectly still while listening, his head cocked slightly, as if he were tasting the emotional timbre of the speaker's words on the air. Finch presented himself as a reclusive gentleman scientist, the last scion of a family of naturalists who had been ostracized from London's Royal Society for their radical, almost alchemical, theories on the links between the biological and the spiritual realms. He carried letters of introduction from respected botanists on the continent, documents later revealed to be exquisite forgeries. His story, that of a man seeking solitude to continue his family's persecuted work, was just plausible enough to be accepted by the isolated local community. With an inexhaustible supply of gold sovereigns that seemed too old and pure to be in current circulation, he purchased the derelict Fenwood Manor and its surrounding valley from an heir who was desperate to unburden himself of the cursed property. The price Finch paid was so far above its value that it silenced all but the most persistent questions. He immediately brought in a crew of stonemasons and glaziers, not from the local village, but tight-lipped men from Manchester who worked day and night and spoke to no one. The renovations were bizarre. He did not restore the crumbling manor house itself, but instead invested his fortune in constructing vast, interconnected greenhouses that snaked across the valley floor. The glass was not clear, but thick and rippled, distorting the view from the outside and trapping a strange, golden light within. Most peculiar were the ventilation systems, intricate networks of brass pipes and vents that did not seem designed to air out the structures, but to draw the air from the greenhouses and channel it in one direct. Eyeing towards the black-lacquered beehives, in the manor's old cellars, he built a laboratory that looked less like a naturalist's study and more like an alchemist's workshop, filled with copper stills, glass retorts, and complex filtration systems. He explained to the few who asked that this was necessary to purify his honey, to remove the natural toxins from the rare flora he intended to cultivate. To complete his operation, Finch required a collaborator with a specific and tarnished set of skills. He found him in Dr. Elias Thorne, a disgraced apothecary and botanist from Sheffield. Thorne had lost his license for his dangerous experiments with psychoactive fungi and his heretical belief that plants could absorb and reflect human emotional states. Finch did not approach Thorne with a simple offer of employment. He offered him the chance to prove his wildest theories correct. "The medical establishment mocks you, Doctor," Finch proposed during their first meeting in Thorne's cluttered, detritan laboratory. "They call your theories fantasy, but they are merely blind. They study the vessel, not the essence. I have bred a catalyst, a creature that can bridge the gap between the botanical and the psychological. My bees do not merely collect pollen. They collect emanations, the very pheromonal residue of a soul in turmoil. Imagine, Doctor, a pharmacopoeia of human feeling. True, verifiable, repeatable." The offer was irresistible. It was a chance for Thorne to vindicate his life's work, to move from ridiculed theorist to pioneer. In exchange for his botanical expertise in cultivating specific, mood-altering plants within the greenhouses and his chemical skill in refining the final product, Thorne would be a full partner in the greatest biological discovery of the age. His private journal chronicles a mind slowly tipping from scientific awe into moral abyss. May 12, 1833. Finch is a genius, a true visionary. He calls it emotional husbandry. We cultivate specific plants, varietals of wolfsbane to amplify paranoia, nightshade to encourage delirium, a strain of weeping orchid that seems to thrive on melancholy. The women, our patients, live among these blooms. Finch posits that as their emotional states intensify, they release a unique bioaerosol, a human nectar, which the plants absorb and then exude in their pollen. The bee is his unique strain. August 5, 1833. A new patient arrived today, a young wife committed by her husband for excessive grief over a lost child. She was placed in the orchid house. The silence from those glass walls is profound. Finch insists the women are at peace, communing with nature. But I see their faces through the warped glass. They are not at peace. They are being farmed. Yet the honey from that hive, we distilled a single drop. Finch calls it Nectar of Lethe. I administered it to a hysterical patient, and the effect was instantaneous. A complete cessation of anguish. A placid calm. We are creating a cure for pain itself. Can a cure be a sin, no matter the cost of its creation? I must believe we are doing God's work. I must. The Fenwood apiary's reputation spread not through advertisements, but through hushed, reverent whispers in the drawing rooms of London and the hunting lodges of the gentry. The Nectar of Lethe became the ultimate secret indulgence of the elite. A single, doll-sized vial of the golden, viscous liquid could fetch 100 guineas. It was the perfect, discreet solution for troublesome relatives. A spoonful in a daughter's evening tea could quell her unseemly passion for poetry. A few drops administered to a wife could silence her inconvenient objections to her husband's affairs. The apiary became a byword for miraculous transformation. The women sent to Fenwood were a catalogue of Victorian anxieties. There were the hysterics, whose emotions were too large and untidy for a patriarchal world. The melancholics, who failed to display the cheerful gratitude expected of their station. The intellectuals, who dared to read novels or worse political tracts. And there were those suffering from genuine, profound trauma, grieving mothers, betrayed wives, whose raw pain was an embarrassment to their families. The common thread was a spirit that refused to be neatly contained. To Alistair Finch, they were not patients, they were vintages, each one a unique emotional terroir to be cultivated and harvested. The first person to sense the rot beneath the blossoms was a local poacher named Arthur Croft. A man in his 60s, Croft knew Sorrow Vale better than his own hands. He knew its sounds, its silences, its smells. And for 2 years he had been troubled by the changes at Fenwood Manor. The valley's natural sounds had been replaced by the ever-present, low-frequency hum of the hives, a sound that seemed to deaden all others. One moonless night in the autumn of 1835, while checking his snares near the estate wall, Croft was startled not by a sound, but by its sud. Den jarring absence. For a brief moment, the constant hum of the bees stopped completely. The silence was so absolute, so unnatural, it felt like the world holding its breath. It was followed by a new sound, a frantic, high-pitched buzzing from a single direction, like a swarm, but concentrated and impossibly loud. Driven by a lifetime of instinct, Croft crept towards the source, one of the massive, mist-shrouded greenhouses. Peering through a warped pane of glass where the condensation had cleared, he saw a scene that would curdle his blood. Inside, the air was thick with pollen and the sickly sweet scent of exotic flowers. In the center of the room, on a simple wooden chair, sat a young woman. She was not restrained, but seemed frozen in a catatonic trance, her eyes wide and staring at nothing, silent tears streaming down her face. And she was covered in bees. They were not attacking her. They were crawling over her skin in a shimmering, living shroud of black and gold. They clustered at the corners of her eyes, drinking her tears. They swarmed around her mouth, drawn to the moisture of her breath. They blanketed her hands and neck, their humming a dissonant, overwhelming symphony of sorrow. Standing a few feet away, observing with the cold, dispassionate curiosity of a scientist, were Finch and Dr. Thorne. Finch held a small notebook, making calm, precise entries. Thorne adjusted a valve on a nearby brass pipe, subtly altering the composition of the air flowing into the room. They were not torturers, they were farmers, calmly watching their crop being harvested. As Croft watched, frozen in horror, he realized the truth. The women were the flowers, their pain was the nectar. And the bees were the harvesters, collecting the very essence of human despair. Croft fled into the night, the image of the weeping woman and her living shroud burned into his mind. He ran to the local constable, a pragmatic man named Baines, and stammered out his story. Baines listened with a skeptical frown. He was a man who respected wealth and title, and Mr. Finch was a gentleman of means and science, while Croft was a known poacher. The constable agreed to a discreet inquiry. Finch received him in the manor's clean, austere study, the very picture of refined scholarship. He was calm, articulate, and utterly convincing. When Baines mentioned the poacher's fantastic tale, Finch smiled a thin, pitying smile. "Ah yes, our API immersion therapy. It can seem rather alarming to the uninitiated," he explained, his voice smooth as honey. "You see, Constable, modern medicine is so crude, leeches, purges, restraints. We believe in the healing power of nature. The unique resonance of my bees' hum has a profoundly calming effect on the overwrought female nervous system. Their venom, administered in microdoses through their presence, acts as a natural sedative. The woman your poacher witnessed was in a state of deep, therapeutic tranquility, releasing the morbid humors that caused her distress. It is a breakthrough." The explanation was brilliant. It sounded scientific, progressive, and humane. It played on the growing interest in natural remedies and dismissed Croft's horror as the ignorance of a simple country man. Finch gave Baines a tour of the pristine patient rooms and the immaculate laboratory, showing him charts of blooming cycles and honey purity. He was offered a taste of honey, a simple, sweet clover honey, not the potent nectar of Lethe, and sent on his way with a generous donation for the local constabulary fund. Baines left feeling reassured, yet deeply unsettled. A detail nagged at him. During the tour, he had glimpsed several of the female patients through doorways. They were indeed tranquil, too tranquil. They sat in chairs, staring into space with a placid emptiness that was more disturbing than any violent hysteria. It was the stillness not of peace, but of profound absence. And there was the smell that clung to the entire estate, not just flowers and beeswax, but something else, something cloying and faintly salty, like the scent of unshed tears that had hung in the air too long. He had done his duty, he told himself, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that what was happening in Sorrow Vale was not healing. Following the constable's visit, a new and more profound quiet fell over Sorrow Vale. Finch, ever the master of control, implemented acoustic dampening measures. He had his workmen line the inner estate walls with thick layers of peat and wool, not to keep sound out, but to absorb it within. The constant hum of the hives seemed to thicken, pressing down on the valley, a low-frequency sedative that discouraged visitors and soothed the anxieties of the few locals who were paid handsomely for their silence and their deliveries. The apiary's cures became more frequent and more disturbing. Lady Annabel, the daughter of a marquis, had been committed for the scandalous offense of authoring and publishing a book of political essays under a male pseudonym. She was a firebrand, her letters filled with wit and righteous fury. She returned to London society 6 months later, a serene and beautiful shell. She would sit for hours in her father's library, surrounded by the books she once devoured, staring at the spines with a placid, uncomprehending gaze. When asked her opinion on the government's latest policy, she would simply smile and say, "Whatever my husband thinks is best." Her father was delighted. Her former intellectual peers were horrified. A lady-in-waiting who helped her dress one evening swore she saw a faint, almost imperceptible hexagonal pattern on the skin of Annabel's back, like a ghostly honeycomb just beneath the surface. Then there was Alistair Vance, a gifted watercolorist whose passionate, vibrant landscapes were beginning to attract serious attention. Her family, fearing the bohemian life she craved, sent her to Fenwood for a period of rest and reflection. She came home utterly changed. Her hands, which had once moved with such fluid grace, were now clumsy and still. When presented with her own canvases, she showed no recognition. When given a brush and paints, she held them with the awkward confusion of a person who had never seen such tools before. The creative fire in her eyes had been utterly extinguished. Dr. Thorne, a man now fully adrift in a sea of laudanum and honey-laced sherry, chronicled the apiary's terrifying success in his journal. His scientific awe had been completely eclipsed by a creeping, existential dread. November 2nd, 1836, we have perfected the vintages. The honey harvested from the orchid house where the grieving are kept yields the purest nectar of Lethe. It erases sorrow. The greenhouse filled with nightshade and wolfsbane, housing the defiant and the angry, produces a darker, thicker nectar that erodes memory itself. Finch calls it the nectar of oblivion. He is now accepting commissions. A duke paid a small fortune for us to house his disgraced son, not to cure his gambling debts, but to harvest his reckless abandon. Finch is creating a library of human essences. The operation expanded. Finch no longer just treated patients. He became a consultant to other, less sophisticated asylum owners, selling them his calming honey to pacify their own inmates. His correspondence files, discovered later, showed a thriving black market. He was selling specific vintages to physicians experimenting with mood alteration, to politicians seeking to influence rivals, and even to artists and poets who, in a grotesque irony, consumed the distilled passions of others to fuel their own flagging creativity. But the web of silence began to fray. Alistair Vance's older brother, Dr. Julian Vance, a respected physician at Guy's Hospital in London, refused to accept the family's relieved narrative. He was a man of logic and empirical evidence, and the sister who returned to him was a biological impossibility. The vibrant, complex woman he knew had been replaced by a placid automaton. He began a quiet, methodical investigation. He spoke to the families of other cured women, uncovering a terrifying pattern: universal amnesia regarding their time at Fenwood, a complete loss of their defining personality traits, and in several cases, the strange, faint hexagonal scars on their skin. Finch's scientific methodology, which Julian began to piece together from hints in Thorne's published botanical papers and his own medical deductions, was a perversion of nature. Thorne had cultivated hybridized, psychotropic plants. He crossbred known toxic flora to create new species that targeted and amplified specific emotional states. The air in each greenhouse was a carefully calibrated chemical cocktail. The API immersion was the core of the process. The women, their emotions heightened by the drugged air, would release complex pheromones, the bioaerosol. Finch's bees, Apis mysta, had been selectively bred over generations to be drawn to these human pheromones over any floral nectar. Finch claimed in his notes to have achieved a symbiotic consciousness with the hive queens, allowing him to direct their harvest towards the most potent subjects. The final stage was the distillation. The emotionally charged honey was not simply bottled. It was refined in Finch's alchemical laboratory. Using complex processes of heating, cooling, and filtering through charcoal and specific mineral salts, Thorne and Finch could isolate and concentrate the essence of a single emotion, creating their vintages. The Nectar of Lethe, harvested from sorrow, was their bestseller. But their private ledgers listed more experimental concoctions: the Nectar of Terror, the Nectar of Rage, and their most prized and dangerous creation, the Nectar of Ecstasy, harvested from women in states of religious or romantic delirium, a substance so potent it was sold by the single crystalline drop. The apiary had process. At nearly 200 women, the most successful cases were sent home, their families paying exorbitant fees for their silence and the continued supply of maintenance honey. But Julian's research uncovered a darker truth. Dozens of women had never returned at all. They were listed in the apiary's doctored records as having chosen a life of contemplative tranquility. In reality, they were the permanent crop, women whose emotional wellsprings were so deep they were kept as a continuous source for the most valuable nectars, farmed until their minds and bodies gave out completely. It was Julian's persistent, informed questions, sent by post to Fenwood Manor, that finally marked him as a threat Finch could no longer ignore. He had found the loose thread that could unravel everything. The system that Alistair Finch had built, a perfect, hermetically sealed engine of emotional vampirism, was not designed to withstand a foreign enzyme. It was designed for the broken and the terrified, not for the cold, calculating fury of a woman who understood his methods better than he knew. That woman was Clara Isabel Reed. She was not a patient, she was a casualty of a commercial war. Clara was the daughter of a brilliant London apothecary who had been developing his own, genuinely therapeutic tinctures for anxiety and grief. Seeing a potential rival, Finch had used his network of influence to orchestrately ruin him. A wealthy client of the Reeds died under mysterious circumstances, and evidence, a bottle of her father's tincture, laced with a poison only Finch's labs produced, was planted. Her father was destroyed, and Clara, who had helped create the remedies, was declared mentally unstable from the trauma and conveniently committed to the care of the very man who had engineered her downfall. From the moment she passed through Fenwood's gates, Clara was not a victim, she was an investigator. Her highly trained nose detected the olfactory assault immediately. The cloying sweetness of the orchids was underpinned by the bitter, metallic tang of aerosolized alkaloids. She recognized the scent of diluted wolfsbane, of belladonna, of plants used not to soothe, but to induce paranoia and heightened emotional states. When she looked at the other women, she saw not madness, but the textbook symptoms of chronic, low-dose poisoning, dilated pupils, trembling hands, and a profound psychological suggestibility. She understood. The greenhouses were not gardens, they were chemical priming chambers. Finch and Thorne saw her resistance as a fascinating challenge. They placed her in the greenhouse reserved for the most defiant spirits, a hothouse of neurotoxic flora designed to shatter the will. But Clara fought back with knowledge. She knew which leaves secreted oils through their pores, which flowers released the most potent pollen at dusk. She controlled her breathing, feigned compliance, and learned to mimic the vacant placidity of the others. Behind this mask, her mind was a razor, observing every detail. The shift changes of the stoic groundsman, the delivery schedule of chemicals, the precise timing of the harvests. Her moment arrived with the fury of a biblical plague. A freak summer hailstorm, with ice the size of marbles, swept through the valley, shattering dozens of panes in the greenhouses and sending the delicate ecosystem into chaos. The carefully balanced atmosphere was disrupted. Alarms, silent and sonic, rippled through the estate. In the frantic effort to move the most valuable plants and sedate the agitated patients, a single door was left unlocked, the entrance to Dr. Thorne's private laboratory in the manor's cellar. What Clara found there was the madman's Bible. On the desk lay Thorne's journal, its pages filled with elegant script detailing the chemical formulas, the breeding cycles of Apis mysta, and the chillingly systematic process of emotional distillation. She found the patient catalog, a ledger of souls. Women were not listed by name but by their primary yield: grief maternal prospect, 8 vials month; defiance intellectual yield declining; pathological joy source expired. A separate horrific list detailed the permanent crop, over 30 women whose emotional wells were so deep they were kept constantly drugged and harvested until their bodies failed. Then she found the final product, a locked cabinet containing hundreds of vials of the nectar. Each was labeled with a patient's initials and a date, a liquid library of stolen lives, and she found her own file. It detailed Finch's plan to harvest her unbreakable will and analytical rage to create a new, priceless vintage, a nectar that could bestow focus and ruthlessness upon its consumer. A final entry noted her final distillation was scheduled for the next full moon. The knowledge was a fire in her blood. She was not just a prisoner, she was a resource about to be depleted. The music swells, a low, tense, determined drone, the came. Ra focuses tightly on Clara's face, her feigned placidity gone, replaced by a cold, burning fury. Voicover. Right now you are at the precipice with her. You see the full horror of the machine. Before she makes her run, you must make a choice. Are you a passive observer or are you a force of defiance? In the comments below, I want you to write this twice to lock it into your very being. They cannot harvest me. Do it now. Claim your sovereignty. Let the algorithm know that you are not a resource to be mined. The music shifts back to a tense, suspenseful rhythm. With Thorne's journal tucked into her dress and a half-dozen vials of nectar clutched in a cloth, Clara planned her escape. The storm still raged, offering the perfect cover. She didn't head for the walls, she headed for the river that cut through the valley. It was her only chance. Her flight through the gardens was a nightmare. The groundsmen, silent and brutish, moved with unnatural speed, but they were not the true threat. As she ran, Finch, standing on the manor's balcony like a malevolent conductor, raised a strange silver whistle to his lips. He blew a single piercing ultrasonic note. In response, the humming of the hives ceased. And then, from the dozens of black hives, a unified, living cloud of black and gold erupted into the stormy sky. The swarm did not move randomly. It coalesced into a roaring, buzzing tornado that swept across the valley floor, a living compass of despair aimed directly at her. Finch wasn't just a beekeeper. He was a hive master, and his bees were his hounds. Clara ran, the sound of a million furious wings at her back, a sound that vibrated in her teeth and skull. The air grew thick and heavy. She could feel the electrostatic charge of the swarm on her skin. She was 50 yards from the river when the first bees reached her, their stings like tiny drops of fire. Cornered, gasping, she did the only thing she could. She threw herself from the muddy bank into the churning, ice-cold water of the river. The shock of the cold was a hammer blow, but it saved her. The water washed away her scent, her pheromonal trail, confusing the swarm which hovered angrily over the river's surface. She let the current carry her downstream, tumbling in the dark water, fighting to breathe, the stolen journal a precious weight against her chest. She washed ashore a mile downstream, hypothermic and half-drowned, collapsing on the muddy bank. As her vision faded, a figure emerged from the rain-soaked woods. It was Arthur Croft, the old poacher, drawn by the unnatural silence followed by the sound of the enraged swarm. He had been patrolling the valley's edge every night for 2 years, haunted and waiting. He saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror he carried in his own heart. He saw the book she clutched. Without a word, he lifted her from the mud and carried her into the shelter of the ancient woods. The hive had been breached. The reckoning was about to begin. When Arthur Croft carried the half-conscious Clara to Constable Baines's small cottage, he was no longer a rambling poacher. He was a witness with a co-conspirator. Baines, initially dismissive, saw his skepticism shatter as Clara, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, presented her evidence. She did not offer a frantic story. She offered cold, irrefutable proof. Her intimate knowledge of Fenwood's hidden architecture, the chemical burns on her hands from spilling a reagent, and the faint, hexagonal sting marks dotting her arms were damning enough. But the journal and the vials were the executioner's axe. Baines, his hands shaking, unstoppered one of the vials. It was labeled simply A.V. Despair. The constable, a man who had lost his own wife years before, was flooded with a wave of grief so profound, so specific, it brought him to his knees. It was not his grief, it was alien yet terrifyingly real. He felt the cold finality of a closing coffin lid, smelled the scent of his wife's favorite lavender soap, and was consumed by a sorrow so absolute it was a physical weight. He shoved the stopper back in, gasping, his face ashen. The crime was no longer an abstraction. He had tasted it. The journal was even worse. Clara helped him decode Thorne's elegant, damning script. They read the entry detailing the successful hollowing of Lady Annabel. Subject's intellectual defiance has been fully neutralized. Post-treatment assays of her nectar show a near-total absence of complex ideation pheromones. The harvested vintage, rich with suppressed ambition, will be invaluable for our commission from the industrialist seeking to pacify his striking factory workers. Then came the ledger. It was a who's who of the British aristocracy and intelligentsia, a Lord Justice who had purchased Nectar of Terror to give his closing arguments more weight, a celebrated poet who was a regular customer for Nectar of Melancholy to overcome his creative blocks. The network of complicity was a web of BL. Wrought supporting the highest echelons of society. Realizing the explosive nature of the evidence, Baines knew he couldn't trust his local superiors, many of whom had enjoyed Finch's gifts. He bypassed the chain of command and sent an urgent message directly to a contact at the Home Office in London, Dr. Julian Vance. When the raid on Fenwood came, it was swift and silent, executed not by local police but by a grim-faced unit of Bow Street runners led by Julian himself. They arrived in the dead of a misty night, only to find the hive had already been abandoned. Finch, a master of information, had been alerted by his network the moment Clara had been taken in. He and his most loyal groundsmen were gone, along with his research, his hive queens, and his fortune. He had left everything else behind as a final, horrific tableau. In the greenhouses, the runners found the permanent crop, 32 women, alive but in deep, irreversible comas, hooked up to intravenous drips of nutrient fluid and sedative, their bodies still faintly emanating the emotional signatures they had been bred to produce. In the manor, they found Dr. Thorne, who had finally succumbed to his own creations, dead in his laboratory from a self-administered overdose of the nectar of oblivion. The search of the estate revealed the full, monstrous scale of the operation. Hidden ledgers detailed the fates of the nearly 200 women who had passed through Fenwood. Roughly half were cured and returned, their minds wiped clean, their souls harvested. Dozens more, whose emotional yields had diminished, were discovered in shallow, unmarked graves in the woods behind the manor, their bodies showing signs of long-term chemical exposure. The 32 living women were the cash crop, the perpetual source of the most valuable nectars. Thorne's final lucid journal entry revealed the truth of Alistair Finch. He was no English gentleman. He was the last descendant of a line of disgraced apothecaries from the Black Forest, a family that had practiced a dark form of alchemy for centuries, believing that human emotion was the true philosopher's stone. He had come to England, a nation obsessed with progress and propriety, to perfect and commercialize his family's monstrous art. The manhunt for Finch became a legend, but a fruitless one. He had laundered his fortune through banks in Switzerland and the Americas. He was a ghost with infinite resources. The official investigation, however, was quickly and brutally suppressed. When Julian Vance presented the client ledger to his superiors at the Home Office, the reaction was not outrage, but cold, pragmatic fear. To expose Finch's clients would be to destabilize the government, discredit the justice system, and upend the social order. The cover-up was absolute. The official story was that Fenwood was a fraudulent asylum run by a quack physician, Thorne, whose experimental treatments had gone tragically wrong. The evidence was classified at the highest level. The client ledger burned. The comatose women were quietly transferred to a military hospital under a veil of national security and lived out their days as nameless, forgotten Jane does. Fenwood Manor and its greenhouses were razed to the ground, the earth salted and scorched, a desperate attempt to erase a stain that could never be cleansed. Clara Reed and Arthur Croft became heroes who could never be celebrated, their testimonies sealed away. Julian Vance, disgusted by the cover-up, resigned his prestigious position and dedicated his life and fortune to caring for the 32 Sisters of Sorrow and advocating for reform in the treatment of the mentally ill. Clara, using the knowledge she had stolen, worked alongside him, developing genuine therapeutic compounds, forever battling the shadow of the man who had turned her craft into a weapon. Alistair Finch was never captured. For years, unconfirmed reports would surface. A mysterious honey that caused riots in a Parisian salon, an outbreak of mass hysteria in a convent in Spain after receiving a charitable food donation, a reclusive botanist in the Amazon who was paying local tribes to describe their darkest fears. He was a phantom, his science now unleashed upon the world, a chilling testament to the fact that once you learn how to bottle a soul, there will always be a market for it. The Fenwood Apiary was never truly about healing. It was the terrifyingly logical endpoint of a world that pathologizes emotion. Alistair Finch created a perfect, closed system of biological vampirism, turning the very essence of human suffering into a luxury good. His genius was not just in breeding his monstrous bees, but in recognizing that society would gladly pay to have its inconvenient emotions silenced, and that the powerful would pay even more to consume the stolen passions of others. It was the complete commodification of the soul, disguised as the gentle work of nature. The story of Fenwood exposes the illing vulnerability of those deemed too much for their time, the women whose grief was too loud, whose ambition was too bright, whose intellect was too sharp. They were not seen as people in need of care, but as a chaotic resource to be tamed, harvested, and refined. And the deepest horror is not what Finch did, but the conspiracy of silence that protected him. A society that consumed his product, from the grieving father to the ambitious politician, had a vested interest in burying the truth. The system chose to sacrifice the victims twice, first their souls, then their stories. But why should this fable of black hives and spectral honey matter to you, now, in our world of light and information? Because the apiary was never burned down, it was perfected, it was digitized. Ask yourself, what is the modern greenhouse where our emotions are cultivated? What are the digital hives that hum with our collective joy, rage, and sorrow? We willingly offer up our most potent feelings, our outrage at an injustice, our grief over a loss, our passion for a cause, to platforms that harvest them instantly. Our reactions are the new nectar. Algorithms are the new bees, swarming to the most potent emotional signals and distilling our very essence into engagement, data points, and profit. We have all become the willing crop, tending to our own emotional fields for a harvest we do not control. You are here because you have felt the hum of this new, global hive. You have the strength to question the sweetness of the honey you are offered every day. So I leave you with this. Have we simply built a more elegant, more efficient system for the same monstrous work? Is the line between sharing an experience and having it harvested now erased completely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you see. And if this truth resonates within you, do not let it fade. Share this story with someone else who is ready to awaken. Subscribe and strike the notification bell so you do not miss our next descent into the shadows. There are so many stories power has tried to erase. We will unearth them all. Join us next time as we unravel the looms of 14th century Bruges, where a secret guild of weavers did not use wool or silk, but wove with the harvested memories and living nerves of human beings to create tapestries that could predict the future.